Hello and welcome to another episode of Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah. Today, I am super excited to have with me in the studio Dr. Uzma Choudry. Uzma is deeply embedded in the world of deep tech and biotech investing with a 7-year track record of developing and fostering European tech bio ecosystem. Throughout this period, she has backed and collaborated with many brilliant founders and builders in the space. She built out the tech bio investment practice and portfolio at one of Europe's largest funds, where she served on the investment committee managing a portfolio of over £1.5 billion in assets under management and served on the boards of 6 transformative companies. Uzma also serves on the advisory group of the Bioindustry Association. Currently an entrepreneur in residence at Start Codon, a healthcare and life sciences investor and venture builder, she is committed to advancing Europe's unique ecosystem, advocating for sustainable growth and commercialization that leverages the region's strengths in science and research. In today's episode, we talk about the debloating of the life sciences venture bubble.
We have, sort of gone through the end of the cycle and a debloat.
How generous capital has rushed out of the market for life sciences.
A lot of generalist capital that rushes out of the market, so it kind of leaves a big gap.
And how in biotech, you're often focused on de-risking the tech and science rather than scaling the revenue.
In biotech, you're kind of de-risking the tech and the science for a much longer time. You're not kind of betting on scaling revenues.
Why you require deep pools of capital to invest in biotech.
So having deep pools of capital is important.
How platform companies can demonstrate their value through assets.
I think obviously the way that platform companies can demonstrate their value is through assets.
And building a unique bio ecosystem in Europe, which is great at research as well as science.
We need more people like Jason in the European ecosystem and environment.
How we can build the innovation and translation engines in the UK and Europe.
And so I think that is great because what it does is sort of gets the innovation engine and the translation engine and those things.
And how to share, network and support to build a thriving life sciences ecosystem.
Those things are really, really powerful when it comes to sharing network, sharing sort of like knowledge, support,
Uzma's contrarian opinion, there is too much short-termism in venture.
I still get surprised how much short-termist behavior and short-termist view I see in this environment for a game that's very sort of long-term.
Let's get straight into it. This is Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah, the podcast where I talk to the people behind the stories that make the venture capital ecosystem go round. I've been working with startups from pre-seed to Series C for the last decade, and companies that I've worked with have gone on to realize value and exit, or raise funds in excess of $500 million. I really hope you enjoy the episode, and if you have a guest that you'd love to see me have on, or you have a comment on any of the episodes that I've recorded so far, do reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Let's get straight into it. Uzma, really great to have you in the studio with me. Thank you so much for joining.
Great to be here, and I'm excited about the discussion today.
Yeah, cool. Well, let's dive straight in. So I was thinking a little bit about the current kind of investment landscape for bio and life sciences. So what are the current challenges as well as opportunities, I guess, in these sectors, in the investment space, especially given the impact of macroeconomic factors on retail funds, portfolio management strategies, and the difficulties of raising Series B funding in Europe? And you and I have talked, I think, quite a lot about that offline. What are the success stories that you've seen, and how can we ensure that we can replicate those across the vertical?
Yeah, so I'll take it, sort of break the question down into smaller bits and take it from there. So initially, I think in terms of challenge, the unique challenges to life sciences companies in the current landscape, obviously, venture as an asset class has suffered over the last 2 years. We have, sort of gone through the end of the cycle and a debloat, and typically biotech and life sciences suffers more acutely in a down market compared to, software.
Could I ask why?
I think a large part of it is because these companies are not revenue generating until much later stages, and so I think signals of is this doing well or not are not as easy to obtain.
Yeah, there's no, yeah, because there's no traction metric beyond, have you passed this phase 1, phase 2, or something else, but it's very much internal to the business rather than external.
Yeah, and it's also on, considered to be on the riskier end of the VC asset class. So when the market is going through a risk-off attitude, you kind of stay away from something that is, on one extreme end of that risk profile. And then I think the third bit is that it's a much smaller universe of investors that are focused on biotech and life sciences. So again, when they have later stage portfolios that are burning, it's really hard for them to be convinced by a story of an early stage potential unicorn. And finally, what we also see is like a lot of generalist capital that rushes out of the market. So it kind of leaves a big gap. So, so tourists that come into the market because they see excitement and sort of drive the valuations out of reality. And then they kind of, sprint back out of the space as quickly as they came in. And so that's another.
Yeah. And so then sort of thinking about that in terms of kind of post Series A. So I think there's a couple of things, right? So firstly, and we were talking about this sort of in the quick fire, there aren't that many pre-seed life sciences sort of funds, certainly in Europe. To your point, it's a very small universe of investors in any case. And then you had this sort of flight from the generalist capital that came into the market probably in 2020, 2021, especially I guess during the pandemic. Obviously, I would assume a lot of investors got quite excited and hyped up about the potential, but maybe didn't have the staying power. And then thirdly, and we've talked about this far too many times probably on this podcast already, this kind of dearth of late stage capital in Europe more generally. So, one of the thoughts that always comes to my mind, and having worked with some life sciences businesses, they are capital intensive, right? So despite the fact that they are they're not printing revenue often very early, in fact, often for 5, 6, 7 years, depending on what they're building. But the quality and caliber of team that you acquire is very high because you are hiring in scientists, biologists, potentially chemists, et cetera, as well as potentially software engineers as well. So actually they are cost-based heavy, and then there's the cost of trials and so on and so forth, which again, run into the 7 figures at the very least. So for those companies that kind of raise a seed, maybe even a Series A, but are now, haven't gotten to traction or revenue or sort of provable metrics, if I can put it that way, when they come to that kind of Series B, what are they doing? Like, and what is working, I guess, for them?
Yeah, so this is obviously like a really interesting question, and you can look at it through multiple different angles. I think one of them is that, sort of taking a European lens at it. In Europe, there is very much the investing kind of knowledge and experience comes from software largely, other than, your sort of Abingworths and Forbians and, Syncona, Sofinova. It's largely software, and building a company and financing and backing a company in software is very different to bio and requires different kind of capital.
Oh, yes.
And I think the issue that we have is that we see a lot of investors try to structure bio rounds like they would tech rounds.
Interesting.
And you cannot drip feed bio life sciences companies.
So it's either you have to invest a substantial amount of capital or don't bother.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I see is like, some of the pre-seed, funds which do everything from like consumer and software, and then they'll do like random bio bets, and you sit there and think, well, in biotech, it's not like you buy a lottery once and that's it. You have to buy that lottery again and again because there are huge dilutive funding rounds. You need to be able to sustain your stake. And so
you need the follow-on capital
exactly.
as well.
And so I don't quite understand how, and this is again symptomatic of there being a space where, people are just looking at bio through a tech lens. So I think it's important that companies sit down and properly think about what is it that they would need to achieve and deliver to be able to get their next set of investors interested. And then go out and raise. And there are a number of times when I've looked at companies and I have spent a bit of time during funding rounds where, it's sort of like, okay, is this the number you should be raising? Well, actually, I think this will take you twice as long and this will probably,
cost double the
cost.
money.
Exactly. And also you probably need to show this as well before you can,
And so just out of interest, what are those sort of, so with software, to your point, right, it's that proven path of, okay, early signs of product market fit, then product market fit, $1 million revenue, and then, 33222, right, scaling, tripling every year for 2 years, and then doubling for 3 years thereafter. But when you're in a world where that revenue is maybe even 3 to 5 to 7 years ahead of you, what are those proof points? What are the things that you as an investor are looking at say, even Series A, Series B? What are those milestones that they need?
Yeah, and I think you've, hit the point there that in biotech, you're kind of de-risking the tech and the science for a much longer time. You're not kind of betting on scaling revenues and seeing sort of like a product market fit. You're actually looking at, is there a technical moat here? Is there, a discovery or a solution or a drug that can solve the pain points of this population of patients or this number of people, or and so I think in life sciences, it's so different depending on the type of companies you're looking at. So if you're looking at drug development, then it's sort of like actually what kind of preclinical, clinical data do you have? If you're looking at life sciences tools rather than therapeutics, then it's about, okay, have you got an MVP of the tool and have some of your potential customers started using them, and have you got data on this tool that you have is superior, and then sort of more typical metrics like actually how many customers have you rolled on. And then there are companies in patient testing area, and again that's sort of like, have you proven the data and the results in the lab? Have you run these on patient samples? Then setting up a testing lab and starting to get those tests through. So it's just such a big spectrum.
So I was going to ask then. So it sounds like within life sciences, you could be a generalist or a specialist as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there'll be funds that will be sort of purely therapeutics funds, and all they will invest is in like either pipeline of assets or single assets.
Which I learned, valuations that are on a DCF on the asset value into the future, which is, you talk to most, certainly people in finance, within the tech community, like who does a DCF in an early stage business, where for a therapeutics business, you kind of have to. Yeah.
And again, to that point on like, you get those areas, and then you get areas like, sort of more tools or drug discovery platforms, or, sort of looking at some of the more recent stuff around climate or industrial biotech. So how do we kind of move away from our reliance onto petrochemicals? Can we build a circular bioeconomy where we can be inspired by nature to create products and petrochemical alternatives and fuel alternatives, because we can't rely on fossil forever? Or how can we actually use biology cleverly to remove plastic from the environment? And again, those are very different. And as I think we just as we came into studio, we touched on a bunch of the B2B2C aspect of it, like stem cells in dermatology. Then there is that other end of the spectrum where it's kind of B2B2C,
or even B2C if you can get there. Yeah.
And that is really, and that end of the spectrum is really tough, right? Because you've got like a huge sort of technical de-risking to do, and then you're also got a team that's got to be great at building a brand and scaling and hacking growth. And so it's and this is why I think specialist management is paramount in life sciences space. And this is where I think Europe suffers today, in that a lot of the funds that are set up are, they're not specialist funds, or not specialist fund managers, and you can't apply the same kind of rules as tech to bio. And the number of times I've seen a biotech company that's been, valued by, by the tech standard, and they're developing therapeutics, and I've sat down and thought, well, how are you going to raise your next round on the back of this? And thought, how is this investor thinking about their returns profile on this investment. So I think, to that point, you can't drip feed companies. It's important to think through your milestones. It's important to select your investors carefully, and these people are going to be on your journey for the long run. Are they going to be useful? Do they understand the space, or are they going to ask you, well, why is this milestone being pushed out 3 quarters in a row? And those kind of,
because you don't have control over the FDA, for argument's sake,
exactly,
right? So,
exactly. And I think the second piece again, so having deep pools of capital is important.
Yeah.
We're getting so many early stage funds now set up, and there's also a large push towards regional funds that focus on local university ecosystems, but there aren't funds that are looking at Series B plus investments within deep tech and biotech, and that's where you have just a huge gap if you're doing sort of building R&D intensive companies, and we see a lot of these companies then actually relocating to the US,
sure,
and find that kind of capital there. And so I think that would be really, really important for Europe as well. Deep pools of capital, specialist fund managers, and and I think the other part that is super important also is having execution talent. So obviously we spoke about Jason. He's done a bit of everything, has operational background, but
that's Jason at Ori BioTech.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think we need more people like Jason in the European ecosystem and environment. It has improved significantly since I joined venture, where it was still sort of very academic, very green. It's definitely improved significantly, but we don't quite have like the Boston ecosystem here, right, where there is a lot of execution and repeat entrepreneurs, and a bunch of that comes as you see successes in the space.
Yeah. So we have time to go. I mean, like, to be honest, because we're going to talk about the European versus the Boston ecosystem, but I think like the core points there are obviously, this real need to have the deep pools of capital, which again we'll talk about later when we talk about the European ecosystem. That specialist knowledge, which in my head I always had in my mind, well, okay, Switzerland, sort of the home of pharma, like surely we have that expertise, and obviously even in France and the UK and Germany, etc. The vaccines that were produced during the pandemic came out of European houses, right? They weren't developed in the US, so, or at least initially, right? So it feels almost counterintuitive to me that we don't have a more developed ecosystem here. But again, as I say, we'll talk about that. And equally the need for that, so that expertise, but also the need to understand kind of how those milestones work, I think is super important. The next question is kind of allied to that, because I've had this conversation with some founders and with some investors, and this is the kind of this new paradigm of platform versus asset, right? And how you strike that balance. So, there's an ongoing kind of industry debate between platform focus versus asset focus companies. So that's platform focused company is, someone that's building an engine, for argument's sake, for drug discovery, versus a therapeutics business that is actually building out the asset. But from your perspective, and having invested over the last 6 years in the sector, what are the common pitfalls that platform companies face, especially around articulating their commercial value and potentially lacking that kind of expertise in therapeutics? And how can founders in this space improve their narrative?
Yeah, so I think obviously the way that platform companies can demonstrate their value is through assets and data on assets. So what is it, what of value can you create? You can say you have like, sort of a magic wand, but you need to demonstrate what that wand can do for it to be of value to anyone. And so I think, while we have a lot of discussions on, platform versus assets, ultimately
it's all about assets.
It's all about assets. And so I think one of the things that these companies can often, and I see that the one of the challenge is that typically these companies are very sort of platform, it's a platform-based team, so there's a very heavy, robust understanding of the platform and the science of the engine and how to build that engine and what the engine can do. But often enough, that's then also accompanied with maybe a huge weakness in the in-house kind of indication or target specific expertise. So folks who can sit there and help them think through a pipeline build.
So both commercial as well as science.
Exactly.
Right.
So like, if clinical as well as like commercial. So folks who can, sort of say, well, you better stay away from this area in oncology because although it might look super exciting, there are issues around market access that will make it hard.
Merck is already doing this, or AstraZeneca developing, and actually could be a target or whatever.
Exactly. Right. And so I think, companies and this is sort of like in Europe, what I've seen is that a lot of these companies will come out with a story of like, yeah, we can do everything, right? We can solve a lot of these areas, and here's where we're going to go first because it's huge and it's a massive pain and no one can solve it today. And so that's why we're doing this. And there is a lot more of thinking that has to go into like, what is the clinical risk? What is the pathway to approvals? And is a lot of the thinking that needs to go into building that pipeline. And they don't have people internally who can do that. And I don't think these companies bring on clinical expertise that is specific to whether that's cardiometabolic, if you're going into cardiometabolic area, bringing someone on who has developed clinical assets into that space early enough. And so you can end up having like you can have companies that will end up sort of spending so much time on finessing their engine or their platform.
They don't figure out who the customer is.
Exactly. And they don't figure out that, you kind of also need to start showing some early stage data on actually what can this engine achieve that is useful, and what evidence is there that it can produce.
So can I just ask a question there, right? Because this might be very unkind to the incredible founders that are out there building in this space, right? But I wonder whether it suffers from, similar problems that I've seen certainly in ed tech and in more traditional health and med tech, where the question in my mind is, are these founders building are they building a project or a business? And is there maybe a risk that because these are highly scientific, research driven organizations, often having come out of highly scientific research driven organizations, often out of universities, etc., that whole shift from scientific exploration to commercially developing a product or a business for commercial realization, is that possibly also lacking? Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, I think we do see that quite a bit in Europe. And as I mentioned before, I think things have improved significantly. I'm now seeing entrepreneurs over the last sort of 3 to 4 years. I've seen entrepreneurs that are more savvy, that are, understand, right, I need to bring in this person with X experience set that complements my experience. And they're not sort of just looking at it from a complete sort of an entire scientific curiosity and exploration. So I think that things are definitely improving, but that is something that is at least I've observed in the bio and deep tech space, where you can have very academic teams, or they'll hire sort of heads of in the tech de-risking space or as part of their scientific team. And a lot of those folks may have done science in the environment of an academic research group or an industrial research group, where you're working to different timelines, different budgets.
And different objectives.
Exactly, and different objectives. And so then trying to, kind of change that thinking is really tough. I think the other part is obviously also, kind of more around what I see on British boards is like, that there is a lot of sort of, British people don't like confrontation, and they also are really like, they'll just pussyfoot around and waste a ton of time. They will not bring up issues that they think need addressing in a timely manner, and the people around the table will know that there are issues going on.
I can see the frustration like literally steaming off you right now.
But no one wants to be the one who kind of like goes up.
Hey guys, what the fuck is going on?
Exactly. Yeah. And as you know, venture is like, it's time and money. And the longer you all just sit there and wait for someone to kind of, and again, I see this this difference in the boards where I am on boards with some of my American sort of colleagues and counterparts. They adopt the sort of principle of radical candor.
They're very direct,
which is very direct. And we're all grown-ups around the table, and we're around the table because we are excited about this, sort of business, and we clearly have a conviction there. So, I think it's important, and equally, sort of seen early stage boards where people are just sort of like not really pushing in the right direction, or worst yet, as I mentioned, there'll be issues that need sorting. Everyone around the table knows that there are issues that
no one's raising it.
No one wants to be the one who raises it, and then often enough, typically, it's the new investor that comes in and is like, "Ooh, surprise, surprise!" Right, we better start. And the amount of time and capital you lose into that, it's like so bad for capital efficiency. So I think that's more of a British-centric thing that I've noticed.
So just on that point of capital efficiency, then. Because this is a question that I mean, again, working with some medical device businesses, some tech bio, and so on. How should one think about capital efficiency in a pre-commercialized or a business that will take quite a long time to get to commercialization? Right, as we discuss, you're essentially de-risking the science and the technology, but that could be 7 years, that could be 10 years, right? And venture typically aims to work on a 10 to 13 year time frame, but presumably in life sciences, those can stretch out further. Those timeframes can stretch out further. So how do you think about that capital efficiency from that perspective, right? Because again, to your point, right, some of these companies can have multi-billion-dollar outcomes because of the if you solve something in oncology, that's a fairly lucrative space. I mean, apart from the benefits that it provides to humanity, but that could take 15, 20 years, right? Maybe, I don't know. So I guess I'm asking you the question, as an investor, how do you think about those time horizons for these sort of businesses? And actually, in that platform versus asset kind of debate, is that maybe why platforms attract a bit more capital at the moment? Because actually the platform is saleable quicker than the therapeutics, right? In the sense that an asset takes time and money to not only develop, but also to get approved and so on and so forth. Whereas a platform, it can maybe get to market quicker. So I know those are kind of a bit of a jumbled question, but essentially I'm asking, like, what are the timelines that as an investor you think about when you're looking at life sciences? And of course that might change depending on the nature of the business, right?
Yeah, so I think the way to think about, or the way I think about this in life sciences and deep tech, is that, the reason why these companies require so much capital and such a long time de-risking the science or the technology or the clinical asset is because that is where the moat lies. No one is going to acquire you for a multiple of your revenues.
Yeah.
People will, or pharma will look at it, it's like, actually, this is super exciting. Phase 1, phase 2 data, we'd love to have that in-house. And, you'll never be commercializing. You'll never be commercializing that drug or that platform yourself. Pharma will do that. It's like well-trodden path. They know how to do it. They've got their own network. So actually, the fact that it takes so long to de-risk the science is because that's what's interesting. Like, the pharma doesn't want to see...
That's where the value sits.
Exactly. That's where the value sits.
Yeah.
Do your point on, like, yes, I think the story that a lot of people have sort of thought through as they've invested in platforms is like, well, actually, you can kind of like have this, engine that might be very, very, very valuable for, a customer or a farmer. But I think in essence, what we're seeing is that, people want to show
results.
us a proof first, like, you
get this drug to market in half the time frame, or de-risk this asset in whatever way.
And so if you look at some of the like big, for example, if you take like Recursion, big platform-based drug discovery company, it still sort of has taken so much funding and capital, and it's still in like its early stages. They're still like working on assets and bringing assets out, and so that's, I think, how you have to think about the risk here, obviously, to win big, you have to be prepared to lose big, and that's essentially on the extreme end where the bio risks.
Which, to be fair, and this is my kind of hypothesis at the moment, why there's been more generalist funds coming into life sciences, even post a kind of downturn, if I can put it that way. I think in part has been because, I mean, like if you think about the business of venture, that is what the business of venture is, right? Like massive reward, but very strong, very large early stage risk, right? And therefore that actually isn't necessarily a bad thing. And maybe that is where venture should be spending its money rather than next B2B SaaS, spreadsheet on with a front end. But it also brings it back to that whole conversation around deep pockets, the need for follow-on capital, the need for specialist expertise, because again, as an investor and probably as a board member, you are hopefully navigating that path with the founders alongside them and giving them that context and experience around, okay, well, we're here, we haven't hit this milestone yet. I can see us probably getting to this milestone. Well, what happens thereafter? And okay, are you going to run into an issue where actually you're going to struggle to raise that follow-on capital? Because, okay, to your point, you've already raised 50, 60, 100 million, whatever the number is. Where do we go next? And what do we need to have proven to get there? And I think what it sounds like, everything can be distilled into that. If that outcome from an asset perspective is not there, irrespective of whether you're a platform or an asset play, that's essentially what everyone is looking for. Until you can get to that, there is no commercial value, right?
And I think to that point, I think it's sort of really important to have people on your journey who can help you navigate that. And unfortunately, otherwise you're in a scenario of blind leading the blind, and you're sitting in your board meetings trying to teach your investor how to interpret the data. That is not the kind of, that doesn't set you up for success.
And it's probably not the right thing to be doing in a board meeting anyway, right?
Exactly. And so I think and this is why I think it's important that these companies think very deeply about, okay, what other companies have in this space or a similar space done this before, and what have they needed to crack their funding or approval, and how can we get there, and how much capital do we require, rather than sort of taking a very sort of, oh, look at this exciting science, and get overly excited by science, and then everyone gets excited by science, and everyone sat there then trying to
how do we bloody monetize this?
How do we monetize this? And so I think we need to start like supporting companies by having the right kind of people around them, and actually giving, when it comes to fund management, like understand, do these people know much about bio, or is it just a passion? Because nowadays experts is everyone from someone who's read like 2 McKinsey reports on something, like I'm an expert in bio, and I come with complete awareness of, like, I've not built companies before, and I've not, I've not been operational before. I've learned all through osmosis and observing, but
you do understand the science, and you understand the investment side, right?
So, and I've spent the last 7 years again sort of seeing what's working well, what's not working well, and some of the unique challenges of companies in life sciences space. So I think that I think that's something that is super important in Europe today. I think we just have so many like companies where it's
I mean, you set me up really well there, because like my next question is about the European bioecosystem, right? Because we've spoken a lot on this podcast in the past about the sort of comparative strengths and weaknesses of the European ecosystem. We talked about earlier the kind of pools of later stage capital, etc. But for life sciences, what are Europe's strengths in innovation and IP generation, and how would you envisage it could leverage those to build a unique biotech ecosystem, especially compared with the Boston model? And it might make sense for you to describe what you think the Boston model actually is. And does European differentiation come through greater focus on regulatory frameworks, research programs, and capital efficiency, or is it something else altogether?
Yes, I think what is Europe great at? Europe is great at like science and innovative research. So, if you look at the quality of R&D that comes out of Europe, it's brilliant. If we look at, and to your point earlier, there are lots of really, really interesting big companies, including companies working on COVID vaccine, like BioNTech came out of Europe, right? If you look at Illumina, Sanger sequencing came out of the UK, and then that led to the development of further down the road to next gen sequencing. But again, it was a Europe-based company. Similarly, Exscientia, right, out of Scotland, a Scotland-based company. You look at Kymab. So there are so many success stories of companies out of here, and that validates the fact that we have brilliant research happening here. And I think the issue then becomes more on the translation side. I think the second piece that really works well is that we have a huge amount of non-dilutive funding available to companies, and through
grants, venture debt, all that sort of stuff.
Exactly. Okay. And so I think grants, like, the amount of grant capital given to companies in the UK is significant. And as we've spoken about, sort of capital efficiency and biotech being very capital hungry, especially at those earlier stages where you're still doing those few experiments to see if it works or not, or if it sticks or it doesn't. Having non-dilutive funding is super, super helpful. So I think that is something that is quite unique to companies in the UK. And I think the other piece is we're now starting to see regional funds being set up. So, we've got obviously like funds set up north. Similarly, there are now news of similar funds being set up in the Midlands. And so I think that is great, because what it does is sort of gets the innovation engine and the translation engine in those regions going. So, if those are the success stories, those are the handful of success stories that may have come out before that kind of capital got thrown into regions like, Manchester, or regions like Bristol. And now that we're starting to spend more capital in those regions, I am confident that we'll see even more sort of like innovation science come out from them.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you and I also talked about was, I guess, a community-led approach to kind of bio investment. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think communities are super helpful. So one area where we've, for example, seen this is in Bristol, right, where on the back of the Zilio exit, there are a couple of like early stage funds set up by Harry and others, and essentially what they've done is then built a whole ecosystem, investment ecosystem and support ecosystem and builder ecosystem around the university to address some of the challenges that they themselves had as they were trying to build or sort of translate Zilio. And so I think I think that having communities like these in areas where there are those early stage angel, pre-seed investors, incubator support, really helps these companies get off the ground through a peer support, through, sort of funding, through specialist help that they can get. If there's, 10 founders trying to build companies in bio, they'll usually share sort of like some sort of, well, this works well, this doesn't work well. And so I think that can be super, super helpful. And I think we've seen the tech bio community in the UK develop over the last sort of like 6 to 7 years. And a bunch of those companies are, sort of doing similar things. Like they'll go and set up ops in the US. So actually,
what's the playbook?
Exactly. What's the playbook on that end? And a bunch of them have raised, huge funding rounds, like, 100 million plus. Like, okay, how did you go about doing this? What timelines should we be thinking about? And so I think there's a lot of those common learnings, which I think you can really, really harness the community. And, I saw that on a more portfolio level, where once, there were like 8 portfolio companies, portfolio doing bio. Like, great, this founder is brilliant at getting grant funding because they've managed to get 4 million grant funding. So they will do a workshop with X, Y, Z of my portfolio companies who all want to do this. this particular business has gone and set up a clear lab in the US. And I know that two of my other businesses are thinking of, they're doing patient testing and they're thinking down the route of clear lab. Actually, they should sit down and think, speak. And so I think those things are really, really powerful when it comes to sharing network, sharing sort of like knowledge, support, like founders know what the life of other founders is like. And so just support from that end. And also introductions to like, sources of capital.
So, I mean, whilst you were saying that, I was thinking, similarly, one of the companies that I worked with, we set up a sub in Australia because they have a very strong R&D regime, which was super valuable for us, and point around non-dilutive funding, et cetera. Obviously, the UK has an R&D regime as well, but it has been quite difficult to navigate over the last couple of years, I would say. So yeah, I completely get that. And I guess, so maybe take me through what is the Boston ecosystem then? So how would you differentiate between Europe and Boston, or, Europe and US maybe is a better angle, but everyone talks about the Boston ecosystem, which from my understanding is much more kind of pharma driven, much more traditional life sciences, etc. And actually a bit closed shop from what I can tell as well. It's quite an inwards circle. Is that fair, or and should we be trying to replicate that, or just build something completely
different? Yeah, so I think the one of the big differences is just sort of execution talent and people who can kind of sort of, to your point earlier, sort of do science not just from a lens of curiosity and like scientific exploration, but actually like, here's an interesting problem set. We've got, this sort of data. How is there stuff we can do here to build something interesting, right? And so I think there's that part of it. I think the second part of it is obviously like having people who have built companies before, who have been CBOs before, who may have been like, chief clinical, like, officers, or led like clinical de-risking of companies. And so I think there's a lot of that which is just not available to the same level in Europe today. And so I think
it's about the people.
Yeah. And then a lot of the companies that are, success stories, their success has been through, trotting to the US. And so often enough, do these people then come back, and do these people then kind of like, or do they then kind of become embedded in those ecosystems? And so I think that's one crucial like aspect of it, the more entrepreneurial mindset on campuses, and having, sort of a bunch of like builders that aren't just necessarily like focused on university, institutes, and aren't just sort of, related to or anchored at a university, but more kind of actually, here's like, a bunch of hackathons that you can do in a space, bring some founders together. Is there something interesting that, two people with completely different backgrounds can look at and build? So I think there's that more entrepreneurial, more building and builder attitude, and see it's kind of the execution talent, I think, probably more of in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't think that is restricted to life sciences. I mean, it's a point that comes across oftentimes when I'm speaking to founders and investors, etc. Is like all of the talent ends up going to the US because that's where you can scale, that's where the capital are. And then the question is that, if there is an exit, do those founders come back to the UK or Europe and cycle that capital and knowledge and network and so on, or do they remain in the US? And of course, we're seeing, there've been some prominent, certainly in the sort of fintech space, prominent people that have up sticks, moved to the US and are deliberate word, but are consciously kind of comparing US versus UK, Europe. And I get that, and I understand that, but that's also part of the problem. If you'd stayed in the UK, you could have made a difference in the UK.
Yeah.
If you go to the US and just say, well, it's much better here, and the UK is, not all Europe is, hasn't got its act together. Well, okay, be part of the problem, part of the solution sort of attitude. And it feels like to me a lot of the noise that we get about, the UK or Europe is so behind the US. Yeah, but you can come back and fix that, or you could be part of fixing that, especially if you have been someone who has been through it, and has that ability. And I think that's where we're maybe missing the trick. I've spoken to like a number of Italian VCs on the podcast before, and it's really intriguing, and it kind of touches on a lot of the things we've talked about. In that, what a lot of them say is like research and the academic talent in Italy is beyond par. Like, I mean, it's one of the strongest academic countries in Europe, if not if not globally, from a research perspective, etc. But no one stays because there is no commercial opportunity. So they move to the US or the UK or Germany, wherever it might be. And of course, none of them then go back to Italy and try and build again, because they just assume that it's broken. So I think, I mean, what it sounds like is we have work to do. And I think this is, again, about cycles and generations. The other thing I think it's really important to remember is the UK, Europe, etc., from a venture perspective, is 40, 50 years behind where the US is. There really wasn't a UK ecosystem until 2010-ish, right? And to go from nothing to where we are, which is like, third largest venture ecosystem in the world, right? When the other two are US and China, which by definition are, orders of magnitude bigger than we are.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. And yes, there's work to be done, but it sounds like, that's a question of people kind of coming together and doing that. So, Uzma, I have one question which I ask all our guests, or recently have been asking all our guests. I've had, it's interesting. I occasionally don't get an answer at all, but I will ask you and see. And in fact, the last guest who you met gave me two answers, because he correctly identified there's actually two questions in here. But what is one thing that you have a really contrarian conviction about from any area of life, whether that's work, politics, life, socially, or at home? And what is the hill that you would die in defending?
Yeah, this is a tough one, isn't it? So I think one of the things that I find super interesting is venture is obviously a very, very long game, right? And I still get surprised how much short-termist behavior and short-termist view I see in this environment for a game that's very sort of long-term. And you can't, you have to be very careful with how transactional you can be. So I think it's really important for people to remember that, you're working in this environment for 10, 14 plus years, and people that you see on your way up, you'll be on your way down. And I think there's just such a disconnect, because I think people can get so caught up in the hype, in the FOMO, and what they can extract from this person, that investor.
Very transactional, yeah.
Very transactional. And, obviously everyone is here to business, to money, but I think when you're working on 10 to timelines, people also want to work with trust. Very early, unproven. And so I think that's something that, again, I just struggle with, to see that there's such short-termist behavior in the industry, and especially in the last couple of years, going as got tough. We've seen some interesting behaviors, people from funds, and I understand people are under like strain, and their portfolios are burning. You've got 1,001 things to do.
But you've got to have that long-term approach, irrespective.
Yeah, and so I don't see that much. I see people as being very transactional. They're sort of thinking, the next portfolio company, next investment, and sort of what's right in front of their eyes, rather than thinking on a much broader level, to like, I'm going to bump into this founder again at some point later, maybe, or this founder's probably going to know 10 other founders that I may want to invest in, so I have to be thinking, what can I give them, as well as what do I get and what impression they leave with. And so I think that's something that, I have noticed. And this is something that I think the US investors, I've seen some of them really, really well, where they sort of, when they're with you, They're not just there to be like, right, here's 5 of my portfolio companies that I need to raise in the next 6 months, and I love all of them, and you should invest in X, Y, Z. They want to get to know you. How do you operate? What do you care about? And, and look at it from a more mutual perspective. Whereas time and again, I think in Europe, what I see is, or at least it wasn't uncommon for me to see at funds people going on calls with other funds and like, here's like 10 of my companies. Then 2 days later, here's another 5 companies that are all raising, and obviously I'm equally excited. That relationship building, that transparency, is super important. You're not in banking. You're in. People will find out.
It's a people business.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to be honest. I don't think it's necessarily just within venture. I think I see a lot of it just generally. I mean, one of the reasons I built this podcast was because I wanted to build deeper, longer, stronger relationships with people. And, the hack, I probably shouldn't say this, but this is the hack, is, where else in the world would I get an hour and a half of your time, right? Or saying Kanjis or Fred Destins or Josh Bells or whoever, right? Like, where who is going to take an hour out of their day to come and just have a chat with me about all sorts of nonsense, right? This podcast actually allows me to do that. And I think that short-termism and transactional approach is one that I detest. It's something I see too much of online, and it's epitomized by the kind of cold outreach LinkedIn and spam email that you now get. That is, hi, I want to sell. I'm getting emails from service providers trying to sell me CFO services. I'm just like, this is the bottom of the barrel, right? Like when you are selling me my own services or attempting to sell me my own services, something has gone wrong with your approach, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I completely buy that. I don't know that it is necessarily contrarian, but it's certainly true. But maybe the contrarian element of it is that people don't necessarily believe that is the case. Uzma, it's been absolutely amazing having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. For the audience, where can they find you online? Are you on LinkedIn, Twitter? Where's the best place for them to look for you on the internet?
I am more active on LinkedIn rather than Twitter, but you can reach out to me channels, and I'm
amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been absolute.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.